Tonight we begin something special. A journey into a forgotten corner of royal history. The topic is one whispered behind palace walls, hidden behind smiles and ceremonies. When queens couldn't have children, the silent desperation of royal wombs. In the stillness of palace corridors, beneath ceilings painted with gods and angels, there was a silence that stretched wider than any hall. The kind of silence that settles when a queen fails to bleed the right kind of blood. Behind the velvet and lace, beyond the polished mirrors and the practiced smiles, there was a waiting that devoured women whole. It did not scream. It did not weep in public. It simply sat beside them in every room, curled in the corner of their gaze, watching the moon pass month after month with nothing to show for it. They were crowned with gold and expectation, draped in silks and led to beds that were not truly theirs. Beds that became altars, rituals performed not for love but for duty, for dynasty. In that cold, ceremonial intimacy, a queen was not a woman. She was a vessel, a future in waiting, a body wrapped in prophecy. And if she failed, if her body did not swell with purpose, if her womb did not answer, the silence began. It began with whispers in corners, soft enough to be denied. Then came the glances, carefully blank, from ladies who once smiled too easily. Servants moved with new distance. Courtiers measured her steps as if watching a clock. But the worst of it lived not in the palace but in her own skin, in the way her hands lingered too long on her stomach, in the way her prayers became quieter, sharper, more desperate. She may have smiled at public events, touched children on the head with practiced grace, but inside she counted days like grains of sand, hoped with every late hour, despaired at every red stain. Sometimes it wasn't even her fault. Her husband may have been sickly, uninterested, or cruel. Sometimes he had mistresses, many, and still blamed her for the emptiness of the royal cradle. But blame did not need logic. It had tradition on its side. The people did not chant the king's name in the streets when a child was born. They chanted hers. So when no cry filled the palace halls, it was her name that curdled in their mouths. In France, a queen once bled quietly behind closed doors while the court celebrated another false hope. In Spain, a young girl brought from Austria was barely more than a child herself, her body too narrow, her hips unready, yet the weight of empire was placed in her belly. In England, there were queens who lit candles before shrines with trembling hands, whispering to saints as if they could bargain for a single heir. One son, one daughter, one child to make the pressure stop. They drank potions, swallowed herbs whispered to spark fertility. Some let leeches take their blood to rebalance the body. Others prayed until their knees bled. They slept with sacred relics beneath their pillows. They dreamed of small fingers wrapped around theirs. And when none came, they dreamed darker things. That their wombs were cursed. That their ancestors had sinned. That God himself had closed the door. Some tried to hide the truth. They wore corsets laced tighter to mimic the beginnings of pregnancy. They delayed public appearances. They faked cravings. And then, eventually, when too many months passed, when too many eyes began to suspect, they said the word. Miscarriage. It sounded better than failure. It implied that something had been there briefly, even if it left. It gave them a story to tell. It gave them sorrow, and sorrow was more acceptable than sterility. But others were not granted even that mercy. They were divorced, discarded, sent back to the lands they came from. Their dowries returned. Their names removed from prayers. Or worse, they were kept in the palace as ghosts. Their titles intact but their purpose erased. They sat through dinners with new wives at the king's side, women younger, wider at the hips, more radiant in the eyes of the court. They toasted heirs born from other wombs. They smiled, and beneath that smile something in them cracked so finely, no one heard it but themselves. And still the world moved on. Wars were fought. Crowns passed hands. And the stories of these women were folded into the edges of history like pressed flowers, dry, delicate, mostly forgotten. No one wrote books about the queens who never gave birth. They wrote about kings who conquered, about heirs who ruled. As if the absence of a child made the woman herself absent. As if her blood, her tears, her silence meant nothing. But if you listen carefully, you can still hear them. In the quiet corners of palaces turned to museums, where empty cradles rest beneath velvet ropes. In the letters stained with ink and regret, hidden in archives few ever read. In the eyes of their portraits, staring just slightly to the side as if watching something no one else can see. You can hear the heartbeat that never was. You can hear the echo of a lullaby that no child ever heard. There were moments when these women, wrapped in silks and surrounded by candlelight, sat still for too long, and the servants hesitated to interrupt. They weren't praying or weeping or even thinking, just staring at the far corner of the room where no one stood, where nothing moved, where time seemed to curl into itself. That was where the quiet lived. That was where the weight settled. Not on their heads in the form of crowns, but deeper in the chest, where hope once lived and now only silence breathed. Some queens clutched small embroidered gowns hidden in the folds of cedar chests, never worn, never touched by anything but their own trembling hands. They had names in their mouths they never spoke aloud. Names for children imagined but never met. At night, those names sat on their tongues like offerings unmade. They might have whispered them into pillows or into the echo of an empty chapel. Just once. Just enough to know the sound. Time passed differently for them. Not by the calendar or the bells of the cathedral, but by the absence of change. The stillness of their bodies month after month. The untouched nursery, the untouched title of mother. It didn't matter how intelligent they were, how beloved by the people, how diplomatic or gracious or even clever with court intrigue. If their womb remained quiet, their worth was measured in absence. In some courts, whispers turned into accusations. Witchcraft. Coldness. Divine punishment. Their faces would still appear in coins, but their names were passed between midwives and maids with a note of pity or worse, contempt. And sometimes they believed it. Believed themselves to be broken not just in body but in soul. A queen who could not carry a child was a queen who could not carry a legacy. And what was a queen without that? In the Ottoman Empire, women who bore sons rose swiftly in the ranks of the harem, gaining power, respect, even fear. But those who failed to conceive drifted into shadow. Their beauty remembered only in passing. Their names rarely preserved. They lived in gold and silk, yes, but they also lived in a quiet kind of death, invisible even in life. And yet they endured. Not all of them faded. Some turned their attention to other things. Books, diplomacy, religious patronage, or the care of other children in the royal household. Some of them became beloved stepmothers, tutors, protectors of orphans. Their hearts still yearned, still grieved, but they refused to be hollowed out. They built small sanctuaries of purpose where they could, even when history would not write them into the grander tale. Still, they walked through palaces that weren't built for their grief. They smiled at feasts where no one toasted them. They sat for portraits where painters softened the sadness in their eyes. Their crowns were adjusted, their hair was styled, their hands were posed just right, usually resting on the edge of a chair or on a table beside a vase. Never cradling, never holding, nothing in their arms but fabric and air. It is hard to imagine now, in a world that speaks more openly of such sorrow, what it must have felt like to suffer in silence under 1,000 watching eyes. To stand before crowds and nobles and ambassadors, cloaked in expectation, while knowing in some part of themselves that the body had betrayed the throne. And yet still show grace. Still perform. Still kneel in the cathedral and pray, not just for a child but for forgiveness, for value, for meaning. In winter the loneliness deepened. The chill of stone floors. The ache in bones not yet old but heavy with longing. Sometimes they wrapped themselves in furs and walked through royal gardens where nothing bloomed, watching the snow fall over frozen hedges, wondering if the earth would ever awaken, and if they would awaken with it. And in their quietest hours they may have dreamed, not of thrones or crowns or courtly intrigue, but of small fingers curled around theirs, A voice calling mother. The weight of a sleeping child against their shoulder. A life without fanfare. A moment without duty. A single, stolen heartbeat of motherhood, carried not through bloodlines but through dream. Some of them tried not to dream at all, fearing that even sleep would betray them. But dreams have their own rules, and the mind, desperate for what the world refused, would conjure images so vivid they woke with tears on their cheeks and a cradle-shaped ache in their arms. In these midnight illusions, they held children with eyes that mirrored their own, who laughed and reached for them, who whispered words they never heard in daylight. And when morning came and the dream dissolved, the silence that followed was deeper than death. The world around them remained unchanged. Courtiers still bowed. Music still played at dinners. Envoys still arrived from distant lands with gifts and treaties. But beneath the courtly layers, the hidden games, the glitter of politics and pageantry, was the unspoken truth. A queen who bore no heir was a queen whose crown sat lighter each day. Her body, once celebrated, now became suspect. Her value shifted quietly, mercilessly. She was still addressed with honorifics, still smiled upon at ceremonies, but always with that subtle difference. A pause, a glance, a whisper that no longer included her in the future. In their most lucid hours they saw the pattern. How those before them had faded, how those after them might suffer the same. Some left behind journals filled with coded sorrow, metaphors of barren fields and silent springs. Some wrote letters that were never sent, confessing not sin but sorrow. Sorrow for the child they had no power to summon, sorrow for the womanhood denied its most fragile hope. They watched as younger women arrived at court, fresh-faced, hopeful, full of bloom and possibility. They recognized in those new brides the same hunger they'd once carried, the same fear hidden behind the painted lips. Sometimes they hated them, sometimes they pitied them, but most often they simply saw themselves as they once were, standing at the edge of hope before the weight of expectation closed in. There were moments when they found strange companionship, not in other queens but in wet nurses, midwives, servants who had borne and lost children of their own. In stolen conversations in back corridors or in the garden paths far from courtly ears, a glance could pass between two women that said everything without a word. For in that shared ache, in that universal knowing, rank dissolved. And though the palace might forget them, history might skip their names, these fleeting connections were real. They were for a moment human again, not symbols, not wombs, not failures, but women grieving in the quiet together. Some of them lived long lives, far beyond the expectations of the court. When their husbands died or remarried or simply moved on to younger heirs, these queens became relics in the palace, walking through corridors that had once echoed with their youth. They spoke less, moved slower, their hair silvering beneath jeweled pins. But the ache remained, not sharp anymore, but deep and constant, like the echo of a bell long rung. And when they finally passed, often without ceremony, the mourning was polite, official, forgettable. The kingdom turned its eyes to new unions, new hopes, new heirs. The rooms they once called their own were repainted, their portraits taken down or moved to lesser halls. No child came to gather their letters. No heir lit a candle in their name. But still the memory lingers, in the creases of royal bed linens that once held restless bodies, in the faded corners of palace tapestries that watched years unfold. Somewhere, a name that was never spoken aloud still lingers in the stone, breathed once, long ago, by a queen staring at a moonlit ceiling, whispering to a child that would never come. Not because she believed it would make a difference, but because the silence was too heavy to bear alone. There were chambers where no children ever played, rooms where toys gathered dust untouched, where rocking chairs remained still for decades. The maids who cleaned them learned not to speak of them, not to question why a room was kept pristine for a child who never arrived. These spaces were both memorials and monuments to imagined futures. The queens would walk past them sometimes, fingers brushing against door frames, never pausing long, never daring to step inside. To enter would be to admit the shape of what was lost. and yet some did. Some queens sat in those empty rooms when no one was watching, placing their hands on cribs carved by artisans who thought they were making something holy. They might sit for hours in the dim light, surrounded by objects meant for a life that never came to be. A mobile that never spun. A shawl never wrapped around tiny shoulders. A lullaby hummed into silence. The palace was always moving. It had to. It was designed for continuity, for lineage, for spectacle. Kings took new brides. Bastards were legitimized. The bloodline, if not pure, was made presentable. But there were always women left behind in the corridors of power. Women who once were queens of promise, now ghosted by their own stillness. And not all were quiet in the end. Some turned bitter, sharp-tongued, or even cruel, not because they had been born that way, but because years of suppressed grief had calcified inside them, turning softness into stone. Others found strange forms of rebellion. They refused to smile at ceremonies. They refused to bless the new bride. They wrote letters to foreign courts, meddled in politics, stirred scandals from behind veils of widowhood. It was their only way to be seen again. Their silence had become too loud to bear. A few turned toward faith, building chapels and monasteries, carving their pain into stone walls and stained glass. They funded hospitals for women, orphanages for children, surrounded themselves with monks and priests who whispered of eternal reward. Perhaps they hoped to earn, in the next world, the child they were denied in this one. Or perhaps they simply needed something to believe in that would not abandon them with each passing month. But whether they prayed or plotted, remained silent or screamed into the dark, they all carried a wound invisible to the crown and ignored by the historians who chronicled wars and treaties and coronations. In the grand arc of history, their names were often footnotes, brief, ceremonial, unremarkable. And yet, in those names were entire lifetimes of longing. There were nights, always nights, when a breeze would slip through palace shutters and ruffle the edge of a lace curtain, and a queen would awaken with the certainty that she had heard a cry. Just one small cry, in the deep quiet, like a phantom echo of what could have been. She would sit up, heart pounding, and listen. But it was always the wind. It was always the emptiness shifting slightly, as if reminding her it was still there. The seasons turned. Wars were won and lost. Crowns changed hands. Yet these women remained, hidden behind layers of royal dignity and ceremonial smiles. And behind all of it, a question lived on in their chests. Who would remember them, not as queens or consorts, but as women who once waited in the dark with open arms that were never filled? And in some forgotten chapel where no one prays anymore, there may still be a candle lit for a soul who once whispered lullabies to a child who never came. Not out of madness nor even hope, but simply because love, when unspent, still needs somewhere to go. And so that love clung to the edges of silence, like ivy on stone, growing in the places history forgot to water. It settled into gestures no one noticed. The way a queen lingered too long in the garden watching other mothers with their children, the way her fingers curled into her lap when the cries of a newborn echoed through palace walls that were not hers. That ache, unspoken and undying, became part of her breath. She smiled, yes, she waved from balconies, she attended ceremonies with jeweled grace. But inside her the empty cradle still rocked. Time does not heal what is never allowed to be named. And so it became something else. Something quieter, deeper. It became ritual. A private rhythm of survival. She might have kept a single ribbon from a gown meant for christening. A silver rattle never given. She might have whispered stories into a firelight not for anyone to hear, but simply to release them. The stories she never had the chance to tell a child of her own. There were others like her across the centuries. Queens of Poland, Castile, Sweden, Russia. Some whose names survive only because their absence made history possible, because their childlessness changed the line of succession, altered treaties, started wars. Their emptiness mattered politically, but personally it was never asked how they felt. Rarely did the chroniclers care what sorrow passed behind royal eyes or what prayers were offered in the middle of the night by a woman curled in solitude beneath tapestries of glory. And yet it wasn't only queens. It was duchesses, consorts, noblewomen whose faces grace oil paintings but whose stories were reduced to dates and titles. Women who endured whispered blame for the crumbling of dynasties and the fading of family names, as if they alone bore the fault for what nature withheld. Some learned to armor themselves in cold elegance. Their smiles sharpened into shields. They mastered diplomacy, outmaneuvered rivals, held court with unmatched grace, and yet behind every word was the echo of a lullaby never sung. Their power was hard-won, but even then, even when they held influence and favor, their bodies were still measured by what they had not created. There were women who adopted children quietly, unofficially, whispering affection into lives not bound by blood. Some poured their devotion into nieces, nephews, ladies-in-waiting, young lives they could shape gently, even if the bond was borrowed. And while these gestures may seem small to history, they mattered. Because love displaced does not vanish. It finds a way to root itself even if in shadows. And there were nights when they walked alone, perhaps down candlelit halls when the court had fallen asleep, listening to their own footsteps on cold marble. In those moments, it wasn't queenship they carried. It was absence. Not weakness, not failure, but the raw shape of longing in a world that gave them everything but the one thing they were told mattered most. History has always spoken loudly of kings and their sons. But if you listen closer, beyond the triumphs, the parades, the royal births, you might begin to hear the quieter story that runs beneath it all. The story of the women who waited, who prayed, who wept behind closed doors, and who lived their lives surrounded by voices they helped raise but never bore. And even now, centuries later, in the palaces that remain, their presence lingers. In the softness of a chair no one sits in. In the portrait where her eyes are not looking at the viewer but slightly to the side, as if still waiting. As if listening for a voice that never came but was never forgotten. There were days when the sun shone too brightly for morning, when the bells of the cathedral rang for someone else's child, when the laughter of a foreign princess echoed through the halls and reminded her of the daughter she never held. On those days the queen smiled like porcelain, polished, still, and utterly hollow. People mistook her composure for strength, but it was simply exhaustion turned into habit. She had grown used to not being asked what she carried within, to living as a symbol more than a soul. She learned how to disappear in plain sight. At court functions she wore the right colors, she raised her goblet at the appropriate time, she tilted her head to the music and pretended to hear joy. But she spoke less. She observed more. She became a presence instead of a participant. And because no one dared name what was missing from her life, no one comforted her. To do so would have meant acknowledging the wound, and wounds of that kind were considered inappropriate for display, especially when they bled invisibly. There were seasons when she believed truly that she had moved beyond the sorrow, that her body was simply her own again, no longer bound to the weight of expectation. But then a single thing, a cradle being prepared for another woman, a flower left by a child at a statue's feet, the way a breeze moved through curtains at dusk, could reopen everything. And in those moments she was back in the silent war with her own flesh. Back in the soft ache of what had not become. Time gave her lines around her eyes and silver at her temples, but it did not erase the shape of the child she imagined hundreds of times. That child had no name she could say aloud, but it had lived inside her thoughts so vividly that it felt real. A little hand that once curled around her finger in dreams. A voice she almost heard once while half asleep. She never told anyone about that voice. She feared it would vanish if she gave it breath. In some courts she was pitied. In others she was quietly blamed for weakening the royal line. But most often she was simply forgotten. Filed away in genealogies, her name footnoted beneath her husband's and beside a dash where children should have been listed. And still she endured. Not because she lacked sorrow, but because she carried it like a second skin. There were no monuments raised in her name. No epic tales sung about her. But perhaps, somewhere beyond the reach of records and royal scribes, there were those who remembered. Not the queen but the woman. The woman who walked each night past the nursery she never entered. The woman who whispered to her own body like it was a stranger. The woman who sat still for portraits with hands resting on her lap instead of cradling anything at all. And maybe in some echo of the soul her imagined child grew old with her. A presence beside her as she aged, invisible to all but her heart. In the quiet hours of dawn before the palace awoke, she sometimes reached out, not knowing if it was memory or madness. But she reached anyway, because grief, when left unspoken for a lifetime, needs touch, even if it never touches back. And in those final years, when the court had long since moved on, when new queens bore sons and sons became kings, she became part of the palace's background, like the statues in the gardens or the tapestries in the halls, silently bearing witness to a world that no longer needed her. Her gowns were simpler now, though still elegant, and she walked with a grace that no longer drew eyes. The servants had changed. The courtiers whispered of other women. Yet she remained, still seated at the edge of ceremonies, still watching the lives she might have lived unfold in others. She spent more time in the chapel then, where the light came in filtered and soft. It was a place where no one asked her anything, where she could sit beneath stained glass depictions of mothers and children without the need to explain the longing in her gaze. Sometimes she lit candles not just for the souls of the departed but for the soul that had never arrived, the one who had always lived only inside her. A flame for the unseen. A light for what never was. Even the priest, old and kind-eyed, knew better than to ask. He merely nodded when she entered, left her alone in the pew furthest from the altar. The silence there was heavier than the chapel's stone. It did not ask for answers. It did not judge. It simply received. The palace, for all its noise and grandeur, had become quieter to her ears. The great feasts, the music, the parades, they blurred at the edges. But the small things remained sharp. The scent of lavender in the corridors during spring. The chill of the stone floor in the early hours. The sound of a child's laughter echoing faintly from the gardens, carried on the wind like a memory that had never been hers but that she remembered anyway. Occasionally, someone younger would ask her for advice. A new duchess, a frightened bride, someone drawn to the dignity in her silence. She would smile, listen, and give wisdom in the softest voice. But she never spoke of her own sorrow. It was too old now, too sacred. Like a relic she had kept hidden for so long it had become part of her body. To speak of it would be to unbury bones that had already turned to dust. When she stood at the windows now, she looked not toward the horizon but downward, at the people walking through the gardens, the nurses tending to royal children, the flicker of young lives not her own. Sometimes her lips would move slightly, forming words only she could hear. A name, perhaps, or just a thought. The kind that visits you when you are utterly alone, and yet filled with more presence than company ever gave you. And still no one wrote these parts of her story. The chroniclers would remember her titles, the lands she brought to the marriage, the treaties signed in her name. They might note her piety, her composure, her place in the great machinery of royal lineage. But they would not write about the child-sized shoes tucked into a cedar box, or the lullabies she hummed with no one to listen, or the tears she wiped away in the dark so that no one would see the woman behind the crown. History has always struggled to hold grief that leaves no heir. But if walls could speak, if stones could remember, they would tell of her. The queen who ruled nothing but her own sorrow, who held court with memory alone. They would tell of the love that never touched flesh but never faded. Of the life imagined so vividly that it became real in every way except the one the world counted. She was not barren. She was not empty. She was filled with stories never told, songs never sung, arms that had always been open. And even in her final years, when her body grew frail and her steps slowed, she carried within her a kingdom the world had never seen. A quiet place where hope once lived and where, despite everything, it had never truly died. There were evenings when the candlelight flickered against the mirror and she no longer recognized the reflection staring back. Not because time had changed her, though it had gently but thoroughly, but because the woman she saw was not the one she had once imagined becoming. She had been trained from girlhood to envision a future as a mother, as a foundation stone in the edifice of dynasty. A queen not only of lands and titles but of lineage. Yet all that training had led her here, to a room filled with echoes and a life measured not in heirs, but in shadows. And still she did not resent the children of others. She watched them run through the courtyards with bare feet and grass-stained hands, watched their games and scoldings and celebrations with an aching sort of tenderness. There was no child of hers among them, no hand reaching up to grasp hers, but in watching she participated all the same. Quietly, at a distance, with a heart so full of unspent love it pulsed against the lace of her bodice. Sometimes the young ones approached her, not out of duty but because something in her presence felt safe. They sensed no demand, only patience. She would kneel slowly to their level, touch their cheeks lightly, offer them sweets from a pouch hidden in her sleeve. They never knew the weight of the moment, that she cherished each one as though it would be the last. They never saw the glisten in her eyes when they skipped away. He never let them. The courtiers still nodded as she passed, still addressed her by her full title, but she noticed how their conversations hushed when she approached. They no longer asked her opinion on matters of succession, inheritance, or alliances through marriage. She had become a ceremonial presence, respected but irrelevant. She did not protest. She merely smiled, knowing that in some deeper sense she had stepped outside of history's script. In the quiet moments she wrote, not letters for diplomacy or documents of state, but words no one would read but herself. She filled pages with memories, with dreams, with questions. Sometimes she addressed them to the child who never was. Sometimes she wrote from the child's voice back to herself, imagining the comfort that had never come. These pages she hid in a carved box behind a false panel in her private room. It did not matter if no one ever found them. She wrote because the silence inside her had begun to speak. And as seasons changed, so did her place in the palace. Rooms that once belonged to her were repurposed. Her portraits were rehung in smaller halls. A new queen, younger, expectant, glowing, now held the attention of the court. She watched this new woman with a gentleness that surprised even herself. There was no jealousy in it, only a sorrowful recognition. She wanted to protect her even knowing she couldn't. And the days went on. Rain fell on the stone courtyards. Music drifted from distant wings. The scent of bread baking, of ink drying on parchment, of polished wood in sunlit libraries. All the familiar textures of her life continued, unchanged by her presence or her pain. But she had changed. The girl who had once arrived with a dowry and a prayer had become a woman made entirely of memory. In the evening she took to walking the oldest corridors of the palace, those that echoed more and flickered with softer torchlight. She traced her fingers over carvings worn smooth by centuries of touch. Sometimes she whispered as she walked, not prayers but fragments, lines of lullabies, bits of stories, names never spoken aloud. The silence replied, as it always had, with stillness. When she grew too tired for walking, she sat by the window in her chamber, a small fire at her back, and watched the moon climb the sky. She often imagined it as a cradle of silver hanging above the world, holding all the dreams that never reached earth. Somewhere in that glow, she thought, lived the shape of the life that might have been. A child's laughter carried in starlight. A future she never held but had never released. And still she sat quiet, watching. Waiting for nothing, yet carrying everything. A queen without an heir. A woman without a child. But not without love. Never without love. In the final winters of her life, when the snow settled thick along the stone balustrades and the light through the frost-streaked windows looked more like memory than sunlight, she found herself waking before dawn. The palace was silent then, not with the silence of courtly restraint but the true stillness of a world momentarily at rest. She liked those hours best. No footsteps, no voices, no expectations. Just the muffled world and her breath moving slowly through it. She would wrap herself in a heavy shawl, pour a small cup of warm spiced wine, and sit with her hands cupped around it like an offering. She no longer spoke aloud much, but the thoughts inside her were vivid as ever. Not memories exactly, though she had many, but echoes. A child's fingers clasping hers as they stepped together down a staircase that had never been descended. The press of a sleeping head against her shoulder in a dream so persistent it had become part of her. A voice that sometimes laughed and sometimes called out "mother" in her mind, though no real lips had ever formed the word. The world outside had moved on, of course. The new queen bore a healthy heir. The bells had rung for 3 days. The court rejoiced. The kingdom rejoiced. And she had smiled, genuinely even as she watched the child being presented at the chapel. But that night, alone again in her chamber, she had lit a candle not for the newborn, but for the shadow of the one who had never come. A silent vigil. Not in protest, not in jealousy, but in love, pure and undiminished, though it had never had a body to cling to. She sometimes wondered what she might have been had she been born outside a crown. Would the loss have stung less or simply differently? Would the absence have been met with sympathy rather than scrutiny, with understanding instead of isolation? But that path, like so many others, was not hers to walk. She had been born into duty, and duty had cost her something unnamed, something history had never found words for. Still, she did not consider herself broken. She had survived when she was expected to vanish. She had created rituals of remembrance in a life where others saw only silence. She had left traces even if the world would not recognize them as such. A quiet hand offered to a frightened girl on her wedding day. A lesson given to a child not her own. A night spent at the bedside of a sick chambermaid, whispering comfort through the hours. These were her gifts. Her legacy was not in blood but in presence. The snow thawed eventually, and with it came spring. The birds returned to the hedges. The palace gardens stirred with life once more. Children, those belonging to others, ran laughing through corridors she had walked in silence. She watched them with the same expression she always had, sorrowful, tender, but peaceful now too. The ache had settled into her bones so deeply it no longer hurt. It simply was. And if, in the very end, she closed her eyes and reached again for a hand she had never held, it was not in desperation but in gratitude. That longing had shaped her, softened her, made her into a woman more full of love than history could ever measure. When the bells tolled for her passing, they rang slowly, respectfully, but without fanfare. There were no heirs to wear black in her name, no dynasties to declare mourning. But in one distant room, a chambermaid lit a single candle and whispered a prayer. In the nursery once prepared and then abandoned, the air moved as if someone had opened a window, though none had. And in the minds of a few, just a few, she remained not as a queen forgotten, but as a woman who had carried within her something as vast as any crown. And the silence at last seemed to rest with her, not as an absence, but as peace. Years after her death, the palace staff discovered that the cedar box hidden behind the false panel contained pages upon pages of her looping, delicate handwriting. No official seal marked them. They were not meant for state archives or royal biographers. Some pages were filled with simple observations of dawn light on the gardens, the sound of rain on leaded glass, the fragrance of lavender as maids beat dust from tapestries. Others held words addressed to a child who never knew a cradle, lines of bedtime stories, notes of encouragement on first steps, imagined birthdays, small sketches of tiny shoes and awkward stick-figure family portraits. The scholars assigned to catalog court papers paused over those sheets, unsure whether to file them under correspondence, poetry, or prayer. In the end, they placed them in a brown envelope stamped private, then slid it deep into a drawer no one opened again for decades. Visitors to the palace in later generations felt a hush in her old rooms, though they could not name its source. Guides spoke of her diplomacy and her patronage of orphanages, but the tourists sometimes lingered in the nursery doorway, sensing something left unfinished, an echo of a lullaby unsung. Children occasionally pressed their ears to the cold wooden cradle as if expecting it to rock. They said they heard the faintest heartbeat and were gently ushered out before parents complained. In the village beyond the walls, elderly women told stories over winter fires. They swore a gentle-faced lady in muted gowns sometimes walked the orchard at night, her hands folded, leaving no prints in frost. She was not frightening, merely watching as though counting blossoms that would bear fruit she'd never taste. No one knew her name, only that the orchard seemed healthier those springs and that waking children often spoke of kind dreams where a silver-haired woman kissed their foreheads and told them they were dearly loved. A painter born 2 generations later found a faded sketch among estate sale oddments, a half-finished portrait of a woman with eyes lifted slightly away from the viewer, lips parted in unspoken thought. He bought it for the price of the frame, took it to his studio, and could not stop touching the canvas where her hands should have been. He completed the painting, giving her arms folded gently around empty space, arms curved as though holding something weightless and precious. When the portrait was displayed, critics praised its quiet sorrow, believing it allegory. The painter never explained he had dreamt of the woman each night while working, that she stood behind him, guiding his hand, smiling when he finally painted invisible weight into her embrace. Centuries turned. The dynasty she married into ended. Revolutions remade borders. Yet in each retelling of royal lineages, historians paused at her blank branch. No heirs, no continuation, and moved on. Still, archivists opening sealed boxes found her letters like pressed flowers, fragile but fragrant with tenderness. They read them aloud in a dim archive room and felt tears rise without warning. One archivist, sleepless for weeks after, left fresh white roses at the foot of her weather-softened tomb, though custom had long lapsed. Somewhere a lullaby she never sang still drifts through corridors when moonlight pools on marble. Somewhere a cradle creaks in an empty room, stirred by a draft no window explains. And those who notice, caretakers locking up, scholars lost in thought, find themselves murmuring soft apologies into the dark, uncertain why their hearts ache for a queen whose only throne, in the end, was made of silence and steadfast, unspent love. And as time wore on and palaces became museums, her rooms became part of a tour, another thread in the fabric of royal memory. The guides spoke of her now with reverence, even if they did not fully understand her story. Visitors walked past the canopied bed and the faint scent of rose oil that clung inexplicably to the air, and some paused, struck by a feeling they couldn't name. Children grew quiet there, even the rowdiest ones. Couples held hands more tightly. No plaque on the wall could explain why. It was the absence that spoke. A presence defined not by its loudness, but by the persistent softness left behind. Her portrait, long forgotten in dusty storage, was one day returned to its original frame and rehung in the West Corridor. Guests often stood before it for far longer than they did others. The expression on her face, gentle, distant, quietly luminous, invited something contemplative, as though she saw something they didn't, as though she was still waiting, still loving something just beyond the frame. The candlelight in the palace chapel, too, changed in that era. A visitor, perhaps a stranger, perhaps not, began lighting a candle for her each year on the date of her death. No one ever saw who it was. But every July morning, a fresh white taper flickered beside the small gold plaque bearing her name. It wasn't part of any ceremony. It was quiet, almost invisible. But it remained year after year, lit with the kind of love that asks for no recognition. Once, a schoolchild on a field trip stood before her cradle and asked, "Where did her baby go?" The teacher, startled, said nothing. The child had not read the plaques, had not heard the story yet. But something had been felt, some whisper of what never was. And the child, noticing the silence, gently reached into their pocket and placed a small toy marble inside the cradle. So she won't be alone, they said. The tour moved on. The marble remained. Stories like hers rarely take the center of history. They are too tender, too complicated, too silent. But they remain at the edges of time, like the quiet curves of a forgotten melody, waiting for someone to listen. And for those who do, who step lightly in those chambers, who breathe more slowly as if not to disturb something sacred, they carry her forward. Not in royal lineage, but in remembrance. She had once been a woman whose name was nearly lost in a line of kings. Yet now she lives in the hush between words, in the gentle tap of candle flame against stone, in the pause visitors take when passing her empty cradle. Her life did not fill the scrolls of state, but it found its way into hearts that knew longing. And where longing is remembered, love endures. And so the palace, though renovated and reshaped by the needs of modernity, still held her within its bones. Late at night, when the lights were dimmed and the tourists gone, caretakers sometimes reported the sensation of being watched, not with dread, but with the soft scrutiny of someone who once had no voice and now lingered only in memory. A flicker in a mirror, a curtain shifting when the windows were sealed, a music box playing one brief, ghostly note. None of it frightened them. In fact, many came to think of her as a guardian of sorts, as though her unspent love had seeped into the walls and now kept watch over anyone who entered with reverence in their heart. The marble cradle, long since roped off from touch, bore faint marks on its stone from decades past, worn not by use but by offerings. Over time, more visitors began to leave small things there. A flower petal, a ribbon, a folded piece of paper with no words written. No one organized this. There were no signs inviting tribute. But the act took root, as if some deeper human knowing recognized what had been taken from her and wanted, in whatever small way, to give something back. And still there were the letters. They found new ones, hidden behind layers of cabinetry, sewn into the lining of gowns, pressed between the pages of hymnals centuries old. Each time one was discovered, archivists would hold their breath while unfolding them, as if they had uncovered a heartbeat. These weren't documents of power. They weren't confessions of scandal or secrets of war. They were fragments of a conversation between her and the world that had refused her the most fundamental of joys. One letter, ink faded to the shade of dried lavender, read only, "If you ever find this, I hope you know I loved you still." No name, no date, just the unmistakable impression of a woman who had loved across the boundaries of time and silence. A historian once tried to write a book about her. He combed through archives, traced every signature, followed her presence across treaties and household records. But the book was never finished. He abandoned it mid-manuscript, reportedly after visiting the palace alone one winter and sitting in her room for several hours in complete stillness. When asked why he stopped, he only said, "You can't measure what was never allowed to begin." Instead, her story took root in other ways. In whispered legends. In museum gift shops where replicas of her portrait became unexpectedly popular. In late-night documentaries where soft music played as the camera lingered on her old writing desk, untouched. And always in the hearts of those who walked away feeling something they could not name. A quiet aching like a dream half remembered upon waking. There were poets who wrote lines about her without knowing her name. There were lullabies composed centuries later with melodies that seemed to match the rhythm of her unsung songs. There were dancers who swore that, in the silence before the music started, they could feel the weight of eyes watching with kindness, with longing. It is a strange immortality, the kind not etched in stone or secured by offspring. It is not loud. It does not ride triumphantly through the pages of history books. But it endures. Because there are some kinds of love that leave no grave, only presence. And hers was such a love. It lived in the soft candlelit silence. It lived in the cradle that never rocked. It lived in the hands of strangers who felt compelled to remember her without knowing why. And as long as one person stood in that room and paused, truly paused, and breathed as though not to disturb something sacred, she remained. He always would. And perhaps that is the strange mercy of forgotten queens and unspoken sorrows, that they are never truly erased, only waiting, patient as dust motes in late sunlight. Her presence, never meant to be loud, had become part of the rhythm of the place. No crown rested atop her memory, no lineage trailed behind her like a cloak of heirs, and yet she lingered with a permanence the conquerors and councilmen could never claim. She was not remembered because of what she had given to empire, but because of what she had held within, quietly, painfully, faithfully. On rare occasions, a young woman visiting the palace would stand in her room longer than most. She might run her hand gently along the windowsill, gaze toward the garden, or stand before the cradle in reverent silence. These were the ones who felt her most clearly, not as a ghost or a historical figure but as someone deeply familiar. They did not need the guides to explain her. They already knew. Knew the feeling of waiting, of wondering, of having a heart too full and arms too empty. They left offerings not for tradition but out of recognition. A pressed flower, a written name, a small object placed gently on the edge of the cradle, like a whispered answer to a question that had hung in the air for centuries. The palace itself seemed to change in response. In the years when her room was almost forgotten, the curtains sagged more, the corners gathered more cobwebs, the air felt heavier. But as memory returned, not through grand displays, but in hundreds of small personal gestures, so too did the light. The windows, always slightly fogged, began to let in more sun. The air seemed warmer. Even the birds that nested outside the stone lintels returned more often, as if drawn by something they didn't understand. Some said that a single rose bloomed each spring in the garden below her chamber window, even when the others lagged behind. The gardeners, though skeptical of legend, admitted they never planted it. It simply arrived year after year, soft pink and impossibly early, nodding gently toward the window as if remembering. In the quiet seasons, when the palace closed to visitors and snow blanketed the grounds, caretakers still lit a single taper in her room. They left it on the writing desk, beside a carefully preserved quill and one of the faded pages she had written. Not on display, but simply there. Not for tourists or scholars. For her. As if to say, you are not forgotten. You were never forgotten. And while the world beyond moved on, shifting, growing, forgetting, her story continued not in the headlines of textbooks or the gloss of documentaries, but in the hearts of those who knew what it meant to carry silent dreams. She became a kind of guardian, not of kingdoms or heirs, but of longing, of softness, of unseen strength. Her legacy was not a bloodline, but a resonance, a hum beneath the surface of time. Even now, someone standing in that room for the first time might feel it, might touch the cold stone of the cradle and feel warmth rising through their fingers, might catch their reflection in the old glass and see not just themselves, but a woman who once stood there too, eyes turned toward a future that never came, but a love that never left. And perhaps that is the quiet truth that outlives even the grandest empires. She was not loved by history, but she is loved by memory. There were scholars who debated her significance, of course, as they always do. Some dismissed her as a footnote in a lineage of greater events, treaties, wars, marriages that bore fruit. They spoke in terms of productivity, dynastic value, and succession. They traced her absence like a crack in the great structure of monarchy. But others, often younger, often quiet themselves, saw something more. They began to write differently about her. Not as a queen who failed to produce an heir, but as a woman whose very stillness was a form of resistance, whose endurance spoke louder than legacy. They noted the frequency of her letters, the gentleness of her correspondences with servants, the unusual kindnesses hidden in budgets she approved, extra firewood in winter, new blankets for orphaned children, a surplus of ink for the scribes in training. One doctoral student, years after stumbling upon her archived letters, found herself returning to the palace in secret. Not to study, just to sit. To sit in the long gallery at dusk, where the light pooled golden on the floorboards, and listen to nothing in particular. She never claimed to see a ghost or feel a presence. But she did begin dreaming regularly, dreams filled with cradles, hands brushing against cheeks, lullabies sung in a voice too familiar to be imagined. She wrote about the Queen eventually, not as a thesis, not for publication, just a story long and unpolished, that she folded into an envelope and left tucked into the cradle on her final visit. Over time, more stories emerged. Some believed her rooms held a particular peace that couldn't be explained, that people entered them heavy-hearted and left slightly lighter, that children born soon after a visit there were unusually quiet sleepers, that young women navigating grief, infertility, or endings of other kinds found themselves inexplicably drawn to the chamber and lingered longer than anyone else. No one marketed this, of course. It was never printed on a brochure or built into a tour. But the staff noticed. They left tissues tucked subtly into corners. They made sure the curtains opened fully each morning, that fresh air was let in first before anyone entered. A violinist once held a recital in the palace chapel. It was a late program, quiet and intimate. Near the end, she played a melody that had no name, just a soft, circular tune she said came to her in a dream after wandering the palace alone. The moment she began, several audience members cried without knowing why. When asked what the song was called, she shrugged and said, "It just feels like a cradle that never stopped rocking." And the cradle still stood there, unmoved for generations, yet somehow alive in its stillness. It had become more than an object. It was a vessel, a symbol of longing unmet but never surrendered. Children continued to leave trinkets. Adults too, though more discreetly, rings, folded notes, a worn photograph of someone lost too soon. They left grief behind like offerings. And perhaps that's why her memory lingered so fiercely. She had not demanded history remember her. She had simply left space for those the world forgot to grieve. Late one evening, a woman well past middle age stood alone in the room, her fingers resting lightly on the cradle's edge. She had no camera, no phone, no guidebook. She looked out the window for a long time, as if seeing something that hadn't existed for centuries. Then she said very softly, "Thank you," and left. No one saw her enter. No one saw her go. But the next morning, the staff found a note beside the candle on the writing desk. The handwriting was different, firmer, more modern, but the words carried the same silence the Queen had once written in. It read, "You were never alone." And perhaps in the end that is what matters most. Not the titles, not the politics, not the branches on royal family trees, but the quiet thread that binds those who dream with open arms and empty hands. A love that refused to vanish. A voice that no longer needed to speak to be heard. A presence that history overlooked, but time could not forget. And so her memory became a kind of hush passed down not through grand ceremony but through whispered instinct, a knowing that moved from one generation to the next without fanfare or formality. Those who entered the space with open hearts felt it first, not as a chill, not as fear, but as a warmth, like the weight of a blanket tucked in by unseen hands. The palace staff, long familiar with the rhythms of the building, began to speak of the room in careful tones. They referred to it not as the Queen's quarters or the Chamber of Sorrow, but simply as the quiet room. It needed no further explanation. Even skeptics found themselves slowing their steps as they neared it. Some came expecting nothing, only to find themselves standing for long minutes in front of the cradle, unable to look away. They would feel the sensation not of being watched but of being known, completely, gently, without judgment. It was disarming, disorienting, and for many profoundly healing. A poet once sat cross-legged on the floor of the quiet room well past closing hours, unnoticed by distracted curators. She scrawled fragments in a worn notebook, pages trembling slightly in her hands. When she left, she forgot the notebook entirely. It was found days later and placed carefully in lost property, but no one came to claim it. The last page was dog-eared, and on it, written in a trembling line, was a single sentence. "I thought grief was silence until I found the silence that loved me back." The staff didn't throw it away. There are no statues of her in the courtyard. No feast days in her name. But those who find themselves walking the long west hall at dusk, when the last rays of sunlight hit the marble just so, might catch a glint, soft and golden, across the face in her portrait. And if they look closely enough, they may feel as though the eyes in that painting, so long still and unreadable, are no longer looking past them but directly into them, recognizing their sorrow and nodding in quiet solidarity. Not every legacy is carved in stone. Some are carried in breath, in gesture, in dreams passed through bloodlines of women who never met her but somehow remember. The childless ones, the grieving ones, the quietly enduring. The ones whose stories go unwritten not because they lacked depth, but because the world never learned how to read them. But within this quiet, this soft-lit room tucked into the bones of a palace that outlived empires, her story is still being told, without words, without noise, without need for justification. It exists in the rhythm of slow footsteps, in the breath that catches for no reason, in the tears that fall before the mind understands why. And each time someone steps into that hush, each time a new soul pauses to listen, the cradle creaks ever so slightly. Not from wind, not from age, but from the weight of remembrance, from the presence of a love that refused to disappear simply because the world failed to give it a name. And when the world outside turned ever faster, cities climbing higher, voices louder, days shorter, and attention spans thinner, inside that one quiet room the pace remained unchanged. It did not compete. It did not call out. It waited, the kind of waiting only the forgotten learn to master. Not in bitterness, not in need, but in a profound understanding that some truths don't require an audience to be real. They only need a witness. That witness might be a mother grieving her stillborn child, running her fingers along the smooth wood of the cradle as though tracing the outline of her own loss. It might be a woman who chose never to bear children and had spent her life answering questions with strange smiles, only to enter this space and for the first time feel no demand for explanation. It might be a father who loved a daughter more than words allowed and carried that ache like a sacred inheritance. It might be a child with no name for what they felt except that this place knew it too. And each time without fail the room held them. What had once been merely the dwelling place of a quiet queen became something greater, something softer and more enduring. No plaque could explain it. The tour guides stopped trying. Instead, they would simply pause before the doorway and gesture gently inward. Most visitors didn't ask why. They just stepped inside, hushed by instinct alone. There are stories, of course there are stories, of the violinist who returned decades later and played her unnamed melody again, this time for no one but the empty room. Of a woman who came to leave her grandmother's ring in the cradle and found, beside it, a single pressed violet someone else had placed there the day before. Of a night when lightning struck nearby and the entire west wing lost power, save for the single candle in her chamber that never flickered, its flame holding fast like a breath unbroken by storm. One winter, a child on crutches entered the room, leaned against the windowsill, and stared out into the garden blanketed in snow. She didn't need a baby to be a mother, he whispered, though no one had told him the story. She just needed someone to know she was waiting. He left a mitten in the cradle, woolen and well-worn, and walked away without looking back. No one knows why this room never gathered dust the way others did. The air seemed always fresh, the corners clear, the fabric untouched by time's usual decay. Some believe it was the care of staff, others say it was something else entirely. But whatever the reason, the room breathed. Not loudly, not noticeably, but in the way a forest breathes. Alive in silence, vast in stillness. And in that stillness the queen endured. Not through lineage, not through blood, but through every heart that had ever broken softly, quietly, with dignity. Through every hand that reached into emptiness and closed around nothing, but did not let go. Through every person who had loved and lost and still somehow kept loving. That was her kingdom. Not the lands marked on maps, Not the banners that flew above cold stone, not the golden rings passed through royal hands. But this, the eternal hush where sorrow turned to sanctuary, where absence became presence, and where love, even unfulfilled, was never unlived. And still she waits, not with longing anymore, but with grace. Because some queens do not reign in power. They reign in memory. And as the generations continued to pass, as old calendars faded into newer ones and the faces of the living grew farther from the faces in the portraits, the truth of her presence became less a question and more a certainty among those who knew to listen for it. Not all could feel it, of course. The hurried tourist snapping photos between appointments might walk through her room unmoved, eyes sliding across the cradle as though it were merely wood. But others, those carrying their own invisible burdens, felt the air shift when they crossed the threshold. They couldn't explain it, but they slowed. They softened. And for just a moment, they breathed in a silence that seemed to understand everything they couldn't say. The room became a place of quiet return, not just for those who mourned or remembered, but for those in need of stillness they couldn't find elsewhere. Lovers who had drifted apart sat in her windowsill and spoke for the first time in months. A midwife once visited after the loss of a mother and child in labor. She sat cross-legged on the floor for hours, her hands open in her lap, not praying but simply being. A young noblewoman, pressured to marry, wandered alone into the chamber and wrote her first poem on a folded scrap of parchment, hiding it beneath the cradle as though entrusting it to someone who would understand. Even among the caretakers, those who came and went with the seasons, her chamber was treated differently. Floors in other rooms were swept. Her floors were quietly polished. Flowers were rotated in the grand halls. Her room always received violets, and no one could recall who started it. There were murmurs of night watchmen passing the doorway and hearing the faintest lullaby on the edge of hearing. Not frightening, not even fully real, just a thread of music that vanished the moment they turned their head. And still she remained unspoken in the official tours. No plaques proclaimed her sorrow, no scripted narration tried to summarize her absence, because it was never truly about what she lacked. It was about how she endured, about how she took what the world would not give and turned it into a love that didn't end with her life. She had become a sanctuary, a shrine not to power but to grace, to the gentlest resilience. One evening in late spring, long after closing, a young museum intern forgot her umbrella and returned alone. The rain was steady and soft, the corridors dim with the last low lights of the palace. She retrieved her things but paused inexplicably outside the quiet room. She had passed it a dozen times before, never entering. But that night, without understanding why, she stepped inside. The air was warm, so she moved to the cradle and stood in silence. And then, without thought, she whispered, "I'm scared." The room said nothing, but it held her. She stood for a long time, listening to the rain ticking against the window, the sound of her own breath. Then she placed her palm on the cradle's edge, nodded once, and left. That was how it always was. No visions, no voices, no miracles. Just presence, just memory, just the echo of a love so patient, so enduring, that even time itself dared not disturb it. Because while kings were remembered in statues and wars in stone, hers was a legacy carved in something deeper. In the ache that sits just beneath silence, in the arms that never held but never forgot how to cradle, in the hearts of strangers who stepped into her absence and recognized it as their own. And still the candle burns. Still the cradle waits. Still the room listens. The seasons turned with quiet insistence, wrapping the old palace in frost and bloom, in fog and sunlight as they always had. The world beyond the stone walls changed in ways she would never have imagined. Horses gave way to machines, letters to glowing screens, empires dissolved into democracies. But her room remained untouched by the haste of modern time. It was not frozen, not preserved like an artifact, but gently protected by the strange reverence of those who passed through it and left with more than they came. There were stories, passed between curators and caretakers, that spoke of unusual calm around the room. When a storm once cracked the palace roof, hers was the only chamber left dry. When a child was lost during a crowded exhibition, they were found curled up asleep beside the cradle, breathing slow and steady, no fear in their face. No one could explain how they got there. The doors had been locked. But the child had said simply, "She told me I was safe." Whether that was invention or memory, no one challenged it. Even the historians who once dismissed her began to hesitate. They began to read her marginalia more closely, noticing how often she referred to people by their kindness and not their titles. They noticed her deliberate silence in court transcripts, her refusal to speak where others postured. It was not passivity they came to realize, but discipline. She had made herself small, not out of weakness but out of defiance. Because in a world that measured women by what they bore, she had refused to be only that. She had chosen to hold something else, something quieter, heavier, eternal. She became the heart of no lineage, and yet she lived on in 1,000 unnamed lives. A musician wrote a requiem after visiting the chamber, though he had never composed anything before. He left the sheet music folded beneath a window pane, and when it was discovered, the staff played it softly in the gallery for a week. Visitors paused more often during those days. They lingered longer. Many wept. A painter once asked permission to spend a night alone in her room. He brought nothing but a single canvas and a brush. When the staff returned the next morning, he was asleep on the floor, paint still wet, the image nearly complete. It showed the cradle, bathed in morning light, and beside it, not a ghost, not a queen, but the suggestion of arms reaching from nowhere, wrapping gently around it, holding it still. He didn't sign the painting. He simply titled it, "She is Still Here." It was hung outside the room the next day. And perhaps that was what she had always known, that she would never rule in the traditional sense, that her name would not live in victory or bloodlines. But she had placed something into the world that no war could touch. A kind of mercy. A stillness that could carry the weight of others. She had made herself into a cradle, empty, yes, but never cold. Ready, steady, waiting for all who needed to be held by something that understood. Even the palace stones seemed to recognize her for it. The floorboards in her chamber never creaked. The air there never turned stale. Time seemed to soften when passing through that room, as though it, too, bowed gently before what she had become. And the candle burned still, flickering but never failing. Carried by the hands of those who did not know her name but knew her story. Those who carried sorrow. Those who came with longing. Those who left somehow lighter. Her legacy was not etched in monuments. It lived in a quiet room, a stone cradle, and the silence that speaks louder than history ever dared. And so it was that her story was not handed down through blood but through breath, through the unspoken exchanges between strangers who had all found themselves standing in the same quiet chamber, separated by centuries but united by the same ache. No one needed to say her name. No one needed to define her grief. The room did that work for them, holding all of it. The love, the loss, the weight of longing with nowhere to go. A woman once visited from the other side of the world, knowing nothing of the palace, nothing of the queen. She was recovering from a miscarriage, her first time walking without her partner beside her. She hadn't meant to stop at the palace, hadn't even planned to come to the city at all. But she did, and she found herself pulled by something unseen, something wordless, to that one room tucked away near the western wing. She didn't stay long. She didn't cry. She simply stood beside the cradle, her fingers barely grazing the rim, and closed her eyes. Later, when asked why she seemed different afterward, lighter, calmer, steadier, she could only say, "I left something there I couldn't carry anymore. And someone held it for me." The palace records didn't document that visit. But the candle burned brighter that evening, and the violets in the window, which had begun to wilt from the week's heat, stood up just a little taller by morning. Each year, in early autumn, someone began leaving a single white feather on the cradle's pillow. The staff never saw who. It was always placed gently, clean and soft, as if fallen from the wing of something divine. No one claimed it. No one tried to stop it. It became its own kind of tradition, wordless and sacred. Some said the feathers came from doves. Others swore they had never seen a single bird in the room. But every year, without fail, one appeared. An elderly archivist who had spent decades cataloging royal correspondence once stumbled across a torn page in a forgotten volume. A letter never posted, perhaps never meant to be. In a spidery, deliberate hand, the queen had written only a few words. "To the child I never held, I loved you before I knew you. I will love you long after they've forgotten me." That archivist said nothing about the discovery. She simply copied the line in her own journal and replaced the page exactly where she found it. She told no one for years. But when she finally retired, her final act was to leave a folded piece of paper in the quiet room with those words written in gold ink. She placed it under the cradle pillow beside that year's white feather and left without ceremony. It is said now that when people enter the room and sit for long enough, they feel less alone. Not because the silence is empty, but because it is full. Full of every unspoken grief and every remembered dream. Full of stories left unfinished, arms left empty, hearts left open. The room no longer belonged to royalty, not in any conventional sense. It belonged to everyone who had ever needed to feel that love could still exist, even if the world refused to witness it. Even if no record kept it. Even if it left no heir. She had become more than a queen. She had become a keeper of what the world forgets to hold. The unlived, the unspoken, the unseen. And still the cradle waits. And still the candle burns. And still, behind the hush of time, the quiet room listens. And the quiet room did more than listen. It remembered. Not with the kind of memory that demands exact dates or documented names, but the deeper, older memory that lives in the marrow of things. The kind of memory that echoes in the footsteps of those who walk slowly without knowing why, that tugs gently on the breath of someone who enters with no intention to cry and leaves with their shoulders softened by release. It was in this slow remembering that her presence deepened, not as a ghost confined to the sorrow of her own story, but as something larger now, something elemental. She had become a guardian of silence, a custodian of all the invisible griefs the world pretends not to see. Her chamber did not offer answers. It never tried to soothe with false hope, but it never turned anyone away. There were nights when the wind outside screamed across the palace roofs and branches scratched at the windows, and yet her room remained still, wrapped in a hush so thick it seemed to hold back the noise of the world. On those nights, the candle's flame would stretch tall and straight, unwavering. Staff passing by would pause and glance through the open door, not out of fear but reverence. They wouldn't enter. Not then. The room wasn't empty. Sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, a single figure would appear at the gates. A woman, a man, a child. Not expected. Not part of any official visit. But someone who found themselves drawn there, as if called not by reason but by rhythm. Security would pause, unsure whether to stop them, and then let them pass, because they always walked straight, slowly, with a kind of gravity that said they had come for something that could not be explained. They would walk the long halls alone. They would step into the quiet room. And after minutes or hours they would leave, not lighter necessarily, but more whole. As if something inside them had been witnessed, gently and without judgment. As if they had poured their story into the silence and found, to their surprise, that it stayed afloat. It is said there is a scent in the room, though no flowers are ever placed inside. A soft, clean fragrance, like pressed linen warmed by sun, or a breath of lavender before sleep. Visitors notice it most when they are still, when they have stopped trying to understand and simply allow themselves to feel. Some say it smells like safety. Others say it smells like memory. More letters began to appear over the years. Left in the cradle, tucked under chair cushions, slipped between floorboards, all unsigned. They were not addressed to her by name, for most did not know it. But every letter felt as though it was written for her, and for every person who ever needed someone to whisper, "I see you. I understand. You are not alone." One read, "I could never tell my mother I lost the baby. But I think you already knew." Another, "They told me I'd never be enough. You didn't say otherwise, but somehow you disagreed." And another still, in the shaky hand of someone very old, "I waited all my life for someone to listen. Thank you for hearing me without needing to ask a single question." The room began to hum with these small offerings. Not literally, not a sound that could be recorded or defined, but with a kind of invisible current. A charge in the air like the moment before snowfall, the instant a lullaby catches in a child's throat, the second breath after waking from a dream you almost remember. And still the cradle waits, still the candle burns, still the silence holds, because she is there, not as a ghost trapped in grief, but as a love so vast and quiet it needed no body to survive. She had once been a woman with empty arms in a world that measured worth in heirs. Now she was the unseen embrace that welcomed all who had ever felt unseen themselves. The quiet room had once been hers. Now it belonged to everyone who ever needed to know that love without witness is still love. And as the centuries pressed further into forgetfulness, as names of emperors and the dates of their battles grew faint in memory, the quiet room remained as a secret pulse beneath history's louder heartbeat. Generations who had never heard her name still found their way there, by accident, by intuition, or by a feeling they couldn't name until they stepped inside and suddenly remembered something they had never been told. No technology could capture it. No recording ever picked up more than the faint ticking of time, the occasional rustle of fabric or footfall, the sigh of someone sitting in stillness. But people left differently than they arrived. Something happened between the entering and the leaving. Not a miracle. Not a transformation. Something smaller. Something deeper. Like a knot inside them beginning to loosen. A small girl once entered the room with her grandmother. The child had not spoken in weeks following a terrible loss no one in the family fully understood. While the older woman wept softly by the window, the girl climbed into the empty cradle and lay there without a word. She stayed still, her tiny hand resting on the carved edge. When the grandmother finally turned, ready to guide her out, the girl looked up and whispered, "She told me I don't have to be sad all the time." No one had entered the room since then. On another winter morning, long after the tourists had gone and the halls fell quiet with the hush of falling snow, a former queen from another country came to the palace without entourage, without cameras, without even her name on the guest list. She was older now, no longer adorned with power, her country changed, her titles folded like old linens. She walked the halls in silence, pausing only when she reached the quiet room. She did not speak. She did not sit. She simply bowed her head for several minutes. Then she placed a thin gold ring, one she had worn through 3 miscarriages, gently onto the cradle's edge and walked away. The staff left it there for months. And sometimes, when the light from the west windows poured in just right, that ring would gleam, not bright but soft, as if catching the attention of someone no longer visible, someone who smiled from the shadows. There was something profound in the way the room resisted erasure. Its walls should have aged more, its fabrics should have thinned, its meaning should have dulled. But none of that happened. Each new visitor brought a little more of her back. Not her name, not her rank, but the quiet essence of who she had been. What she had waited for. What she had carried in silence, with a love so steady it outlived memory itself. And now the quiet room breathes not with the absence of a child, but with the presence of every soul who has ever stood on the threshold of love unreturned, of life unfulfilled, of dreams that never found their cradle. It is a place where sorrow is not asked to leave but is instead invited to sit and rest its tired weight. Some say that when the world finally becomes too loud, too fast, too cruel, it is rooms like this one that will save us. Not with declarations, not with monuments, but with one soft truth held gently between the candle and the cradle. That we are not alone in our ache. That love, even silent, even unrealized, even forgotten by history, never truly ends. And so she remains, not behind glass or beneath stone, but in the way a stranger lingers in a doorway, unsure if they're allowed to stay, and the room answers yes without a word. Even the palace itself, with its long corridors and echoing stone, seemed to honor her presence in ways no architect could have planned. There was a softness to the air that passed through her room, a quieting of footsteps as if even time itself had learned to tread gently there. The great chandeliers in the reception hall may have sparkled for dignitaries, and the throne room may have held the weight of crowns and decrees, but it was in the quiet room where something older, more essential, endured. The cradle had grown smooth from centuries of touch, not worn, not damaged, but burnished with reverence. Not just from those who hoped or mourned or remembered, but from hands that didn't even know why they reached out. Fingers brushed across its edge the way one might trail their hand through water. Curious, instinctive, respectful. And perhaps in a way no one fully understood, the cradle remembered them too. Once, a man who had spent his life restoring ancient paintings was allowed a private moment in the room. He sat beside the cradle with his palms resting flat on his knees, saying nothing. After nearly an hour, he pulled from his coat a small square of linen, stained with colors used to restore the faint image of a mother's hand in a Renaissance fresco, and placed it on the windowsill. "Some hands," he whispered, "were never meant to fade." He never came back, but the linen stayed. There were whispers among the staff that the room had started to influence the rest of the palace. That people who visited her chamber began to walk more slowly in other halls. That arguments held in nearby offices lowered their voices without meaning to. That visitors lost in the maze of history would sometimes find themselves inexplicably drawn to her door, not by curiosity but by something gentler. A need they didn't know they had until the room gave them permission to feel it. And it wasn't just sorrow that filled the room. Over time, joy began to return too. Quiet, delicate joy that bloomed like violets in winter. A couple once knelt by the cradle and left a ribbon from their stillborn daughter's christening gown. They stayed for nearly half a day. When they finally rose, they smiled, not because the grief was gone, but because it had found a place to rest. A midwife who had delivered hundreds of babies and mourned more than she could name came to the room on her final day of work. She laid her hands on the cradle's side and whispered every name she remembered. It took hours. No one interrupted. When she finished, she closed her eyes, bowed her head and said, "You've held them too, haven't you?" The flame of the candle beside her flickered once. Then it steadied again. And always the room remained simple. There were no velvet ropes, no elaborate markers. Only the cradle, the candle, and the light from the window. The room needed no explanation. Its silence was the explanation. It told a story without needing to raise its voice, of a queen who bore no heir and yet left behind a legacy that defied the reckoning of history. For the world often forgets women like her. Women who do not break, who do not rise in rebellion or fall in scandal. Women whose grief is quiet, whose strength is steady, whose love outlasts the empire that failed to recognize it. But this room remembered. And because it remembered, so did those who found it. Some nights, when the palace was locked and empty, when the wind danced around the old towers and the stars blinked cold above, caretakers walking past her room would glance through the slightly open door and swear they saw the flame bend, as if stirred by breath. Maybe it was. Maybe she never left. Maybe she stayed, not to haunt, not to weep, but simply to welcome. To remind us that some cradles are never filled because they were always meant to hold something greater than a child. They were meant to hold the heart of the forgotten, the breath of the broken, the love that lingers. And so the cradle endured, a vessel not for royalty, not for legacy, but for the unseen tide of human feeling that slipped through time unnoticed by kings and chroniclers. It had become a gathering place for the softest fragments of the human soul, the kind too fragile for stone, too fleeting for ink. There were no plaques, no documents, no signatures, yet each person who stepped into that space carried something out of it, even if they could never name what it was. A young girl once visited on a school trip. She had no knowledge of queens or cradles, no context for the solemnity of the chamber. But she entered the room and grew quiet, as if the stillness had passed directly into her bones. She reached out and touched the cradle just once, gently, like one might greet a sleeping animal. Later, on the bus ride home, she drew a picture without realizing why. A candle burning in an empty room and a woman with no face, only open arms. Visitors came in every season. They came with walking sticks, with strollers, with briefcases and earbuds and paperbacks tucked into coat pockets. Some stayed minutes. Some returned year after year. They left buttons, poems, bracelets, photographs, even breath mints. Someone once left a bird feather wrapped in linen. Someone else, a tiny wooden carving of a sleeping lamb. No one ever disturbed the offerings. They were not artifacts. They were part of the hush. It became known quietly that if you had something too painful to say aloud, some hurt that language would fail, you could leave it there. You didn't need to speak. You didn't need to pray. You only needed to place it inside the hush and trust that the room would take it. The room always did. It had taken centuries, but the world had begun to understand what that queen had known in her own silent way, that love is not proved by its results, that worth is not measured in heirs or history books. That presence, true, tender presence, is its own kind of immortality. And still people kept coming. A mother brought her teenage son, newly diagnosed with something neither of them knew how to talk about. They stood in silence, side by side, and when they left, he turned to her and said, "That room didn't need me to be okay." A war veteran visited one stormy evening, walking with a limp and carrying nothing but an old scarf. He folded it and left it on the windowsill. When asked about it later, he only said, "She waited so others didn't have to wait alone." A historian once tried to write a book about the queen. He filled pages with her lineage, her role in court, her political affiliations, but every draft felt wrong. Too shallow. Too loud. He visited her room every week for a year and eventually abandoned the manuscript altogether. Instead, he wrote a single line: "She didn't need to be remembered to be felt." That line was etched into a slip of paper and left beneath the cradle. The staff found it the next morning and said nothing. They didn't file it. They didn't log it. They simply slid it back where it had been, where it belonged. And perhaps that's how her story survives. Not in the grand sweeping way of queens who altered history with armies or treaties, but in the quiet endurance of a love that asked for nothing and gave everything. She held space. She made room. She waited. Not for recognition. Not for redemption. But for those who had nowhere else to place their sorrow. And in doing so, she built a kind of sanctuary no throne could match. Still the cradle waits. Still the candle burns. Still the silence listens. And still she is there. In the end, there was no final moment, no grand curtain fall, no sudden hush to mark her passing into memory, for she had been memory all along. She had lived not in the loud pages of conquest or coronation, but in the quiet fold between heartbreak and hope, where so many lives silently dwell. The palace would continue. The stone would wear. The portraits would fade. But her room, the quiet room, would remain, not because history remembered her, but because people did. Not all of them would know why they paused there. Some would sit without understanding the ache behind their stillness. Others would weep without knowing for whom. But in that cradle of silence she held them still as she always had, not as queen, not as mother, but as witness. The one who waited, and in her waiting, made room for all who were ever lost, forgotten, or unloved. And though her name may fall away like petals in time, the hush she left behind, the sacred, steady hush, will never end. Because in a world that often forgets how to listen, she taught silence how to speak.